The lands in the west are at odds, and an old enemy seeps through our borders to the east. Grimhelm will surely fall. In countless villages and towns across the province of Grimhelm, a vast stretch of land in the northeast, separated from the Empire by mountains, and from the world by a sea of trees known as the Mistwald, destitute fathers still recount stories of noble lineage to children who listen with aching pride. Their stories deviate from the official histories stamped and sanctioned by the scribes' collegium, but perhaps there is truth yet in those old tales. While the western edges of the empire are torn by infighting, noble house against noble house, and the heartland's faith is sapped by decadence, the hardy folk of Grimhelm remain resolute beneath the darkening sky and choking mist. Their superstitions and folk ways are like lanterns, keeping their brave hearts ablaze against the unseen tide. The Rugians and Rugovars, they would have us believe, were not conquerors, but rather refugees who fled the persecution of the Meridan kings. They fled into the mountains of the east, God's mountains. There they encountered monks who taught them about God and told them many histories now forgotten. They told them of an ancient race of warrior men who had been forged by God to wage holy war against the dragons of the land. These warriors lived beyond the mountains, in the rich and mighty kingdom of Grimhelm, where they hunted the last of the dragons, including the dragon sire, Scalarion. Led by their cunning chief, Rovar, the Rugians ventured into Grimhelm to seek out these dragon hunters, the Arun, while the Rugovars remained with the monks to learn of God the Creator and to win his favor, along with that of his powerful saints. The Rugians met the Arun and were impressed. The imposing Arun were tall and mighty to a man, clad in impenetrable metal shells, yet they were godly and welcomed the weary refugees, giving them food and shelter, asking naught in return. The Rugians were many, while the Arun were few, for the questing Arun were scattered across that kingdom, living in camps rather than towns and cities, devoted to hunting dark beasts and dragons, or to metallurgy and forging. The king and his prince were summoned, and they met the Rugians. Chief Rogar lived up to his reputation and spun words of silk, and though Prince Aelred distrusted the foreign newcomers, binding promises were made. The king agreed to lead his men into war alongside the Rugians against the oppressive Meridans. Before leaving the enchanted lands of Grimhelm, the Arun taught the Rugian smiths the art of forging plate, armor, and swords. They also taught them the craft of mounted warfare and gifted them 1,000 of their finest war horses. Thus equipped and thus allied, the Rugians and the Arun across the mountains, and uniting with the god-fearing Ragovars, began a war of reconquest that lasted a decade. It ended only when Hrogar the Charmer made an alliance with the leading Metadan nobles, speaking honeyed words of empire and a rich land beyond the mountains. The first emperor was crowned Thelikos of the Ragovars, after the Rugians and the Metadans refused to accept each other's candidates. In the name of the emperor, a host was gathered, 1 in every 10 men recruited, forming the greatest army mankind had ever seen. With this immense force, they marched on Grimhelm, betraying the Arun. The war was short, for the noble Arun had already lost their best battling the Metadans. The few Arun left fled into the vast eastern forests, led by Prince Aelred. Cursing the Rugians, Aelred led his people deep into the Mistwald, drawn ever further by a mysterious voice that beckoned him. He led them to Skalarion's Rest, the mountain where the last dragon was said to have been slain. There, in the shadowed place, the Auron found the intact remains of Skalarion. The greedy dragon had lured his foes to his ancient lair, whispering promises of how they might reclaim their lands and savor vengeance. Skalarion whispered to Aelred that, if he split open his belly, the trapped souls of dragon ancestors long dead would pour forth, ancient spirits who knew of a sorcery taught to them in the dawn of time by God himself. This magic, Skalarion promised, could graft their powerful draconic souls to those of the Aron, granting them the strength needed to vanquish their foes. Aelred, desperate and consumed by hatred, assented. He cut into the dragon's bloated girth and outslit the foul mist cascading down the mountainside like a roaring tide. The voices of 1,000 slain dragon filled Aelred's ears, bidding him carve runes into stone, bone, and wood. Once completed, the Arun were instructed to feast upon the dragon, to drink its blood, devour its flesh until none remained. The prince, impelled by foreign instinct, thrust his arms deep into the dragon's chest and there dislodged a heavy, fiery heart. He held it aloft, and in Skalarion's voice uttered words unknown, then bit a deep gash and greedily drank the bitter blood within. The Arun fell as one on the scaly corpse like a pack of maddened dogs. The more blood they drank and flesh they ate, the mightier they felt, and they reveled in their swell. But something was amiss, and before the last of the dragon's body was absorbed, Aelred bade his folk stop. And though their hunger burned hot, they obeyed, for they also felt a heavy wrongness settling upon their hearts. Aelred laughed and thanked the dragon sire for his power, but declared that the Arun would not become hollow vessels for dragonkind to puppet. They turned from that mountain, leaving behind the half-devoured cadaver. Yet the mist from the dragon's body was not so easily abandoned. It followed them through the woods, curling through the undergrowth, clinging to their every step, until it sank into their very bones and drove them mad. As mighty as they were, They could feel their own spirits weakening under the relentless assault of the dragon's malevolence, and they knew would not be long before they became the very beasts their ancestors had once hunted with pride. With the last of their will, the Arun carved runes upon river stones into the flesh of small animals and onto the trees that lined their desperate path. And when they reached the river, they bound the stones to themselves, and with sorrowful resolve, leapt into its cold depths, drowning what remained of their noble souls to thwart the spirits that sought to seize them. Under the running water, a war raged for generations. The powerful draconic spirits laid siege to the dead, but were repulsed by noble specters holding fast within keeps of putrid blood and iron. When at last a wet, plated boot set foot on the dry banks of the river Haramir, what emerged was not simply a mingling of warring souls. The crippled remnants of Arun nobility, entwined with the venomous hunger of the dragons, had given birth to something new. Born of unseen friction, it had stolen what it needed from each parent, carving itself into the desecrated tombs of flesh. Hungry bodies crept out of the water like snakes shedding old skins. Thirsting for flesh and pain, they haunted the Mistwald, feasting on unsuspecting animals like the descendants of the very horses they once abandoned. These children of the mist spent decades frolicking in the entrails of their prey, learning, growing, and shifting, nurtured by the dragon's breath. Over time, certain memories and sentiments resurfaced, and a seed of malevolent vengeance took root in their twisted play. A disfigured sense of honor began to grow as well, and the name of Grimhelm loomed bright in their dark minds. Blame was laid, names were remembered, and shadows slid past the trees, falling upon Grimhelm like a long-buried grudge, sharpened to a dagger's edge.
Glocken läuten dunkel in der Nacht, Flammen züngeln, Schrecken schwarzer Pracht, Schritte aus den Schatten drohen nah. Fast schon hier, das Unheil spricht ganz klar. Feuer brennt, es tut